Thank you all for having me. I want to start off by telling you what I'm not going to talk about. We lawyers love detail and we get lost in it, so I was thinking through some of the specifics of your legislation and found myself nodding off, so I'm not going to talk about that at all. What I'm going to do is stick to the really high level, what does good regulation mean? I'm going to try and... there are a lot of parallels in a number of industries that I think will resonate with you, and they'll do that for different reasons, I expect, knowing there's a bit of a mix in the audience. So I really just want to challenge you and get you thinking about those things and give you a bit of an idea about how I see those things fit into good regulation that is really aimed at doing all the right things. The fundamental question is a trite question, but is regulation good? Yes, but it has to be good regulation. Otherwise, it can cause as many or more problems than it's trying to fix. So you just got to think of then, what does good regulation look like? And really your starting point is there might be a lot of things I want, but what are the things we really need? And the things you really need from good regulation is predictability, fairness, proportionality in response. It needs to be practical and achievable. They're the sorts of goals that sit at the heart of any good regulation, and you've just got to keep coming back and revisiting that. And that's particularly true of something like SCAS, where it was born really in a period of crisis, and as the Honourable Joel Fitzgibbons has said, that 5 years is not a bad time for review, and review is not, I agree also, that it's not a reason to be fearful of anything. It's an opportunity to actually bring it back to basics and say, is this regulation actually aimed at what it should be aimed at? Does it have a fair chance of achieving it, and does it strike the right balance with those things that regulation has to do? And I'll come to those in a minute. The outcomes that regulation should aspire to, I'll come to those as well, but really I want to focus more on some of the things that you want to avoid and that you'll be familiar with, I think, from your own experience. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but good regulation is able to accommodate a whole host of influences. It needs to be dynamic and responsive, but it also it can't be sort of beholden to it at the whim of those influences. And you'll all be familiar with those, and I don't want to do much more than flag a few things about them, but live export in particular has very challenging overseas competition issues to deal with in circumstances where you are subject to oversight that is unique. Just how unique that oversight is, I think, gets lost. There are no other export industries in the world that have the sort of obligations imposed on them once the product leaves the country and is in the hands of someone else. Just thinking like a lawyer for a moment, the law is dynamic, but it's dynamic on a grand scale. So things develop over years, decades and centuries, and those changes, they get entrenched, they're fundamental, and they really change the world, but they just don't happen overnight. SCAS as a conceptual legal change was dramatic, and if it had happened or someone had tried to impose it, a judge had decided they wanted to do it, I expect it would have been struck down. So Parliament's perfectly entitled to do this, but it illustrates that over hundreds and hundreds of years, nowhere in the world has the law organically evolved to impose these sorts of obligations. So the fact that the industry's got on top of it, I think, and is dealing with it in a way that is proactive and productive is extraordinary. The size and industry of resources changes, the sort of influences, the way that the regulation really needs to be set up to try and support and guide industry. I'll come to community expectations and political influences, but again, the key there is, and again, the Shadow Minister mentioned this, legitimate concerns. Community expectations are a tricky beast, but the reality is that if you've got a good match between legitimate objectives and legitimate concerns, you're most of the way there. Technological advances are significant in all industry, and often that influences how regulation evolves. So in the case of live export, it affects traceability options, for example. So you can imagine a situation where the mob-based system of dealing with sheep is under question from certain sectors, and there are there are obviously RFIDs and other ways that you can approach reducing that to an individual situation, but there are also very real concerns about whether that's actually effective or whether it's better than the current systems anyway. If you come back to an objective evidence-based approach, those technological advances, once they're properly understood, can and ought to be reflected in legislation, either broadly in the way a regulator exercises their discretion, or specifically, in terms of orders or particular requirements, depending on the situation. The same thing is true of animal welfare. The more that we understand about the various aspects of animal welfare, the more that that can alter the legitimate concerns and the legitimate goals of the legislation. So good regulation has a number of fundamental features. I've talked about a few of them, but the achievable point for me for live export is one of the most critical. You're in a situation where there are obligations on you overseas that are interpreted in a way that could be described as an absolute infallibility obligation, and nowhere in the law is that a real thing. You can't expect anyone to be infallible, and the reality is that we have industry that deals with much higher stakes, or at least very high stakes. Fatalities at work, all sorts of issues, food safety, whatever the case may be, that don't impose a standard that requires you to be infallible. And I think that the regulations have been interpreted that way to an extent, but good regulation makes it clear that you are subject to a certain standard. I won't be too much of a lawyer, but there's a long history in the law over hundreds of years of what that means. It usually comes back to what is reasonably achievable or practical, and that depends on what resources you have and what's reasonably at your disposal to do it. So you've got to make your best efforts. You can't just sit back and let it happen, but you also shouldn't be frightened of in issues of traceability. If there are people who are going out of their way to interfere with your supply chain, and you are doing everything humanly possible, and there are ways to manage that proactively going forward, the regulatory outcome from that shouldn't be a black or white, you fail or you haven't, your licence is gone or it isn't, or you're sanctioned or you're not. There needs to be some sophistication there. And that sophistication needs to be predictable and proportionate. So that's what good regulation looks like. I think I've talked about the other two. I agree also with the Shadow Minister that change is really important. Change is an opportunity in regulation, whether it's starting from a good place or not, to actually come back and have a really careful look at what it's doing, and it's an opportunity to basically set the scene for the next decade or two of an industry. And I think that's where live export is. I think you've weathered a pretty challenging 5 years or so, longer really, but I also think that the industry is changing dramatically, and it's entering a more sophisticated, bigger, different scale of operations. It's taking a more prominent international role on certain things. There are a whole host of things that take it out of the realm, I think, of where it was before, and mean that provided you're on top of it, you welcome the opportunity to review those sorts of things. What you want in those sorts of reviews is you want to get to the point where you have a good feeling for what the legitimate objectives are, and you want the laws to be managed or changed if necessary or refined at the right level in the right way. So through Parliament with a considered, well-supported and explained process, that's the way you do it. That's the ideal. You can't always do that, and there are situations where that's overkill, but that's the bottom line, and I think that's appropriate in this case, particularly because of the level of oversight that there was and consideration of those changes for SCAS. It's been a bit of sort of, let's get it in there and deal with it. Over those 5 years, I think everyone's learned a lot, and it's time to do something about that, but it needs to be properly based in evidence, and that evidence goes back to the things that affect not just what's a legitimate goal, but also what is reasonably achievable, and what is the legislation trying to balance. And legislation is always balancing competing concerns, and that's difficult. Then there's the second tier, which is the one that gets the most focus, I think, and that's dealing with or interacting with those who are tasked with interpreting and applying regulation. So regulate whoever it might be, whatever the situation, and that's really a behavioural thing. So you might have a period of time where the people within the department, operational or otherwise, are really very sensible, open, approachable, commercial, whatever. You know, there are a whole host of things that can happen, and they can decide, for whatever reason, the political climate may allow it, maybe their own views, who knows, to approach the interpretation of the law in a particular way, so that you get a behavioural outcome, you get an application of traceability obligations to you that is set at a certain level. But just it's important to understand that those things are transient. So however much work you do on guidance notes with a department, or however much work you do getting them to understand the industry and to actually to police it, oversee it really is a better word, in a way that is better matched to reality and to the industry's needs and to all those competing interests. All of those things can change in an instant and can actually be influenced by the politics, by discrete issues that are really concerning in a way that good regulation shouldn't be. So if you have a situation arising that creates real consternation or enormous media interest or pressure or whatever it might be, good regulation should respond the same way it did the week before to the same situation. But behaviourally within the department, there's a real chance that won't happen. So those things are important because they're often the practical interface, but they're not, at the longer term, they're not the focus. And then reform options, there are times when they fade into the background, but I think for live export, for reasons you'd already know a lot about, that this is a really important time. The industry is really lucky, I think, to have the two complementary organisations in ALEC and LiveCorp. They have different roles, and I think they both do them really well. And what that does at the moment, in a situation where you have some pretty comprehensive submissions to the Productivity Commission, which is very good bedtime reading, you should all grab it. Or Sam will give you a 5-minute rundown. But it's that goes to the substance of what the regulation should look like, and then there's all of the other factors that go around that help to get to the point where that starts to gain some traction. But you've got a real opportunity to actually lift your sights and say, how's the industry going to look for the next 10, 20 years? How are we going to set it up? In a lot of ways, being subject to obligations that are unique and probably unexpected a while back, that's changed a lot of things. But in the position you're in now, it's actually, I think it's not a bad starting point to think how you want to evolve, rather than to look inwards and try and manage the detail of how that affects the business from time to time. And that includes taking a really broad international lead on these things, which feeds back into social licence and other things. There's one point I really want to make strongly about legislation, and this industry has suffered it a lot, but it happens in all challenging legislation, and that is that you get ideology masquerading masquerading as a legitimate objective. So for you, that means the legitimate objective is animal welfare. The ideology might be nobody should eat meat, right? And so good regulation distinguishes between the two, or at least is protected against it. So sharks are a big issue everywhere at the moment, but that's we have it particularly in WA, but there's even more issue of focus in New South Wales at the moment, where there tend to be more unprovoked attacks, whatever that means. I had to look around to work out what unprovoked meant, or who would provoke a shark, but it happens apparently. But they're the three things. Conservation is a legitimate objective. Safety is legitimate for sharks, for people swimming, and animal rights and our own ideas about what obligations you have to users at the beach. That all comes into the mix. And so framing the whole debate as we can't interfere with sharks at all is edging towards the ideology end of the spectrum. I mean, I'm not saying I disagree with it, but that is what it's doing. And so in a situation like this, and this happens in live expert all the time, you've got emotive issues, high stakes risks, you've got a situation where the science on how sharks behave and why, how you stop them, all that, when the risk really occurs, when it doesn't, all of that's difficult. So you can't just readily come to a view that shark nets are good, shark nets are bad. Shark nets have obvious downsides beyond the intended benefit. There are all sorts of really complex things in there, and you've got a public that, I don't mean that in the pejorative, the public's not ignorant because they don't care. The public is faced with a really difficult situation where that is complex, and public messages of any description that start getting complex always get lost. So, this is a situation where you're trying to regulate. You've got different approaches in New South Wales and Queensland to WA. You've got federal obligations of conservation sitting over the top. You've got people characterising an animal's right as a sentient being in a different way against a right of people to swim at the beach, and have a measure of protection or safety. And there's a quote, I had to print it because I wanted to get it right, I think that illustrates that. There was a TEDx talk was given by a senior advisor to the New South Wales government a few years back, and I think it illustrates the point. This person said, fortunately, this is the ideology, fortunately a human without a limb is not going to die, but a shark without its fins is going to die, and it's going to die a slow and torturous death. Now, I'm not taking a position on whether any of that's right or wrong. I think each part of that individually is true, although I take issue with not dying if you lose a limb. That's a pretty grim thing to survive. But that is a perfect example, I think, of a really complex issue with regulatory inputs at federal and state level, emotive issues, high stakes, the whole thing, where ideology from time to time gets a little more of a ride than it should, and the regulations, if they're good, protect all stakeholders, really. That's the point. Good regulation balances the interests. I'm going to touch on this really quickly because I'm just a bit conscious of time. There are similar issues with GM crops. The ideology tends to be on safety issues. I think in my view, the legitimate objective or goals are more about sensible coexistence and what that means for consumer choice. That's a different thing. That's my own view. But what that means is that in this situation, you've got agriculture that has coexisted for years with quite different needs, and so you've got specialist seed growers who, if they were to grow their specialist, seed next to someone with a similar crop but without the same obligations, that would be a problem for them. So they take themselves off and they incur the cost and they manage that. In GM cropping, a few of you probably know that there was the recent controversy about whether the GM canola growing in WA was effectively destroying consumer choice because organic farmers couldn't grow nearby and guarantee that they wouldn't have some form of contamination. And we're not talking about light crops, we were talking about different crops, but it doesn't really matter. Whatever the contamination, that's a coexistence issue. Good regulation. In WA, we've just effectively lifted the restrictions on GM crops very recently. So that's where things are going in WA, but that WA is not part of a mass movement here. In Europe, there are many countries that are going in the other direction. There are many people who still say Australia, as an island, should consider the benefits of not doing that. All of those concerns are a mix of sometimes get dressed up as a legitimate goal and are really an ideology, but going through that, you want the regulation to give businesses that have to take commercial risks and have to have some certainty about what's going to happen and what the minimum standards they have to adhere to. The regulation has to respond consistently in the midst of all of that. Quickly, I know there's a whole session coming up on social licence, so I'm looking forward to that. I wanted to quickly just touch on a couple of things about this. Community expectations are a difficult thing because it's really hard to know exactly what it is, and how the hell do you measure it in a way that gives you any real confidence. And the Productivity Commission did, there's a lot in there that I didn't agree with, but they did say one thing I did agree with, and that was that there is a need to work out a way to objectively better capture in a scientific way what the genuine expectations and of the community are. Part of that would be saying, well, which community are we talking about and how does it change? You know, farmers will have different needs and views to people who live in the city, perhaps. People who have a particular interest in, or any special interest groups will have a particular idea about what's a good thing or isn't a good thing. Now, how does that all feed into what a community expectation is? And should you then, if you're dealing with these things in terms of social license, and you want to invite collaboration, do you give the person who's way out at the periphery, doesn't matter if it's on the left or the right, wherever it is, do you give them, do you get them into the tent and give them an equal seat at the table? I think, well, I'll come to that, but the first point about this is I think that community expectation is important to have in mind, but it shouldn't be driving things, at least not in the medium term. It's a longer term thing, and the best way to illustrate that is occupational safety and health, I think. Occupational safety and health has dramatically evolved over 100 years or so. It's evolved quite significantly in the last 15 or 20, and now there are harmonisation of the laws going on, which is again just seeking to refine some of those things. One of those most recent changes is to take, these things matter to lawyers, but it's to take an onus of proof. Is to say, look, if you have an obligation to ensure people's safety at work, what does that mean? Firstly, it used to tend towards the absolute infallibility. Now it's recognised to mean you've got to take reasonable steps. But a while ago, it was the employer's task to prove it. So effectively, the onus was on them. If they couldn't prove they took reasonable steps, they're in trouble. More recently, very recently, those laws have shifted, and it sounds like it's a subtle change. Now it's up to the prosecution to prove that reasonable steps weren't taken. Now that if you're the one who's on the stand with people questioning, whether you met certain standards, that is a significant change. And before that, occupational safety and health evolved with community standards to pay more attention to health. It used to be all about safety. We're going to lose a limb. We're going to have problems in an underground mine, whatever it might be. And it got quite sophisticated at that, but had a blind spot with health. It's evolved, and I think that's evolved because of community expectations, but it wasn't driven day to day, month by month by it. Social licence is important and it's real, but there are some real risks, and the main thing is social licence should never be about appeasement. You're entitled to have faith and confidence in the legitimacy of what you're doing and why and how you're doing it, and you build social licence basically by living those ideals and properly supporting it. And so all these issues about transparency and the rest of it, they're absolutely important. But if they're just there because people want to be able to say we're paying more attention, but they're not actually giving a sort of a fundamental insight into what's going on. And I mean this not just for exporters, but for the regulator as well. It's even more critical in good regulation that a regulator has. The only way to work out that a regulator is applying things proportionately and consistently is to have real transparency. So when you get a show cause notice or a directions letter from the regulator, or a decision on a finding on your conduct that basically says, we looked at this allegation and we looked at that and we've decided you didn't do enough, it should be blatantly obvious exactly why they reached that view, and it really needs to step it out. And I've seen far too many examples where that doesn't happen. So coming back to social licence, sometimes social licence is viewed as a way almost of trying to manage the fallout from that stuff, and I don't think that's what it is. Social licence is more like corporate culture. Corporate culture has gained a lot of traction, particularly in the mining industry more recently, and it matters. If you have the head of a company who's driving anti-corruption, who's driving safety issues, and they are consistent, and it's on the record and it's demonstrable, that has a real effect, and it is a really valuable thing for a company to have. that commitment to social license is really important as well. And I think it has a similar effect, but it has to be grounded in something real. Otherwise you're just messing around on the periphery, I think. I'll skip that last bit. Timing. This is controversial, but what I want to say about it isn't. These are both tricky issues, and I don't know if anyone noticed, this was a while ago now, but it really stood out for me where there were some media reports and just we have obvious quite sophisticated regulation affecting both of these industries, live export and our rights and obligations under international instruments and what we do here for international asylum seekers. And it struck me, it was really interesting. Here we have effectively a competing philosophies or ideologies where the asylum seekers sort of are saying, well, look, I feel like if I was treated like an animal, I would be in far better shape. I have far more rights than I currently do. That, whether or not that's right, the point is that when we're thinking about what the industry does, firstly, I think it's important to recognise that I don't think it can be challenged. The industry takes animal welfare seriously, and I don't think it can be challenged that it's really invested in animal rights, because you can really easily find other areas of public life where there appears to be less attention paid to equally or even more significant issues, and secondly, just to understand that sort of thing is really easily thrown at you. And I mean the animal rights aren't looked after properly, is thrown at you as a way of challenging what you're actually doing. But if you can bring it back, if you've got good regulation supporting you, and you've got good evidence for what you do, you're largely protected against that stuff. Really quickly, I'm not actually sure how long I'm supposed to be going for, but I just wanted to, most of these would be very familiar to all of you, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. I just wanted to point out that the impacts of bad regulation are significant, and it's particularly significant in low margin industries like yourself, where if you've got your cost base is hard enough to control, and if you've made a deal on a certain basis and then at the last minute you find you've got 2 or 3 days of demurrage to stick on top of it, it's not a cost you can defray that easily or pass on to anyone. So these things really matter. The micromanagement comes down to an approach to regulation. It's the command and control versus the more aspirational meeting obligations, and I think we'll maybe talk about that in the panel if anyone's interested. But the general experience through across all industry is that micromanagement can be appropriate, but it's typically appropriate where there's something that sets the thing you're regulating apart. So in occupational health and safety law, a lot of that is managed, even though the risks are very severe, is managed in a high level sort of general obligation sense, where people understand they have to work it out and do the right thing. But there are certain areas like managing dangerous goods where there's a much more prescriptive approach. So it's always going to be a mix of that, and you want to make sure that if there is a prescriptive approach in your industry, you have a say on this, you make sure it's on things that warrant it, and where you're going to get efficiency and outcomes that matter. I've talked about achievability. Regulatory creep's an interesting one, because this is the distinction between breeders and others, where behaviourally, it's a good example of the behavioural impact. The regulation is pretty clear on what your obligation is, but that hasn't stopped the department from seeking to impose obligations that don't exist in the regulations on those involved in exporting breeders. And we all know that in practical terms, pushing back on that stuff, you might be in the right, but it's difficult to do. And there are significant cost impacts for everyone. The regulator's under a lot of pressure as well, and has real challenges to manage these things. And good regulation makes it a lot easier for them to have clarity about what's expected of them as well. It goes both ways, and in my view, it's at least as important, if not more important, that the regulator has that rule book that really makes it easy for them. given the time, I don't think I really need to talk about that at all. I just want to say one more thing about social license, and that is it really is different for export industries. It's very different to export industries to an industry if you've got something locally where effectively the people that you have the social contract with are deriving a benefit from what you're doing, and you are in turn deriving a benefit payment or whatever it might be. But in this industry, you've got community expectations and social license obligations being sort of thrown around in a situation where the customers are offshore. And they're not the ones who are asking you to do this stuff, and they're not the ones who have a vested interest in what you invest in certain aspects of the business in order to meet that need. They're just, they've got completely different a basis for doing that. And I think that significantly changes the way that you ought to approach social license and community expectations. It doesn't diminish the value, but it just means that you shouldn't be afraid to put your money where your mouth is and just stand up for, if you think you're doing the right thing and you can support it, that's the starting point, and you bring everyone to you. You don't let the tail wag the dog too much. I think that's me done. Thank you.